Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Living Out podcast, the show where we, a bunch of same-sex attracted Christian friends, discuss faith and sexuality. I'm going to be your host today. I'm Andrew Bung, and today we're continuing our series, Questions That No One Wants to Answer. We're venturing into complex and controversial territory, discussing what people don't like to discuss, even if it might be difficult, because we believe these questions are important and it's worth wrestling with them. And today, our question no one wants to answer is, why am I gay? And to help me answer that question, I'm really glad to be joined by my friends Ed and Andy. And guys, this whole series has been, it's the last episode of it today, about the questions no one wants to answer. So I want to ask you, what is the question about yourself that you dread being asked? And I'm going to pick on Anne first.
I was deliberately not looking at you,
Didn't work.
I think the question that I dread being asked is, do you have any phobias?
Ooh. We should just save these up for the next series of the podcast. We'll use these as our opener question. Is that because you're worried people will use it against you?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I had the same. Yeah, I don't want my best mate to know what my big favour is. I don't trust him at all. Yeah. I'm not going to be nice. I'm going to ask you, Andy, what's your question you dread being asked?
Yeah, I hate being asked any question that involves an impact on anybody else. So if I'm out with a group of friends and people look to me and say, so Andy, are we going to do Indian, Chinese or pizza? I hate that because, my instinctive reaction will be, well, what does everybody else want? Any question that involves me making a decision for other people, I loathe because I will just feel permanently, guilty.
You are one of those beautiful people who is just too nice.
Oh, thank you.
Ed, what's your question you don't want to be asked?
I'm not one of the beautiful people.
You're not too nice.
They're too nice. I think that's quite clear. Oh, actually, I don't. I find it when people sort of ask about, so are you married? Do you have kids? Actually, oddly, I find that quite a difficult because it's often used as a bit of small talk, but it's quite complicated, the answer, and so I just don't like being asked that question because you think, oh, yeah. I actually had it with the church once who were asking me to do a weekend away on being same-sex attracted, and the person organising said, I sent him my profile and description, and he got back to me and said, you said nothing about your lovely wife. I was thinking, I said to you, do look at what I'm speaking on. And then there's this very embarrassed email back going, oh, I'm sorry. And just anything about family and kids seems to then produce quite an embarrassed conversation, either on my behalf or their behalf or everybody's behalf, and I'd like to avoid that.
I hate it when you ask that question and you say, actually, I'm quite happily single, and they don't believe you. I've had that. We're just waiting for the right person to come along. Like, well, not really, no. But, there we go. Mine would be, and it might be a question we've done actually, I hate being asked the really mundane questions like, what's your favourite film? So I don't really have one. What kind of music do you listen to? Just because they're the kind of things that I think reveal how weird I am.
To be honest, you're ashamed, aren't you?
It tends to not be a connection point with people. So if someone new, a good way for me to alienate people is to talk about my musical tastes. So that's my question. Don't ask me that if you had to get the joy of meeting me. We've warmed up with some questions we don't want to answer. We're going to tackle the question, why am I gay? A question no one wants to answer. We are tackling the question, why am I gay? A question no one wants to answer, I guess maybe because people think it's just too complex, maybe it's too controversial, maybe actually sometimes we feel it's too scary. Maybe we're kind of worried what answer we're going to find. Maybe we might particularly feel that if we ourselves are gay or same-sex attracted. But we're going to give the question a go today. First of guys, help me with this. Why do you think people sometimes feel this question is really important to ask?
Well, I mean, I found because people want to cure you. So, I found that people want to ask me this question, why are you gay? Because once I've sort of come up with a reason and I fit it into perhaps a particular category that's in their minds, they're going to be able to come up with a plan to make me straight and to enable me to be able to answer that question about family and kids by saying, yes, I've got a lovely wife called Beryl and we've got 15 children, all with the names beginning with B. And that's the destination. And basically the start of that journey to being straight begins with work out why you're gay, solve that problem, hey presto, life will be fun.
I think related to that is sometimes a desire to kind of prevent people becoming gay. So, parents not wanting their children to be same-sex attracted and wondering if there's anything that they need to do differently or not do so that their children don't turn out to be gay.
Ed, you've been asked this, right?
Yeah, no, that's right.
Do you mind telling the story?
Well, no, I was at a conference and the question, it was one of these sort of, questions came in and it was put polite. I can't remember how it's a beautiful sort of English context in which the rude question was just sort of dressed up so nicely, but it was basically, how can I stop my child becoming like you was what it was. And I rephrased, I said, I think the question you're asking is this. And there was a sort of silence in the audience, and it became pretty clear that that's what they're asking. And then as I sort of named it like that, and that friend of mine sprung in at that point and answered the question for me in quite a beautiful way. But I probably don't have time to share that beautiful story.
We might get to it later.
I guess those who are finding it hard to be gay or same-sex attracted, they might ask the question, and it might be with a sense of, is somebody to blame? Am I to blame? Have I done something wrong? Have my parents done something wrong? So perhaps people, when they're at that stage of really wrestling with their sexuality, they're finding it painful to live through, perhaps, might be a question they ask with a, who's to blame for this?
So you're giving 3 reasons why some people think this question is really important to engage with. And I'm kind of picking up the sense in the room that maybe actually we don't agree with those reasons. And actually there's some risks almost really this question we're picking up there. But maybe another one, and a reason why it's good for us to talk about it in this episode, is because it's a question people do ask, and maybe particularly those of us who are gay or same-sex attracted might ask ourselves. And maybe actually what we can do in this discussion is think, what are the helpful and unhelpful ways of thinking about this question? Because it is probably a natural question for us in our life experience to come up with. Let's talk now then about some of the common answers to this question. What answers have you heard given to the question, why am I gay? And what do you make of those answers?
Well, I guess it's just worth saying there are just ever-growing number of answers to this question. And there's some people, a lot of gay campaigning over the last 10, 20, 30 years has been based on the idea that you're born that way. And that's been a massive sort of slogan. And yet at the same time, you've got radical lesbian feminists who are saying it's a choice, and increasingly, saying that actually, it is a choice that you make to push against the patriarchy. So, just worth saying that there are just wildly opposing and different answers to this question, and an ever-growing number of answers to this question that are coming from very, very different places, and a lot of heat, because clearly, born that way, it's a choice, couldn't be more sort of diametrically opposed, both coming from, leading secular thinkers in our society today.
And I think I'm realising more and more as I talk to more same-sex attracted Christians about their story, how different those stories are and those experiences. So I knew that I was gay from very young, kind of 5 or 6, but I've got friends who, it was more kind of around puberty time, or, I've got friends who didn't realise they were same-sex attracted till they were in their 30s. And so it can be very difficult and dangerous to make generalizations, I think. So I think that's one of the things that I would counsel somebody asking this question, that there is no sort of one size fits all approach, and it's actually difficult and dangerous to come up with reasons why somebody might be gay, because everybody's personal experience is different. That's not to say that there aren't factors that maybe influence our sexuality. I think all of us, whether we're gay or straight or however we would define our sexuality, I think to some extent that is probably, there are probably genetic factors that play into that, and there are environmental factors that play into that.
I mean, I think the reality is there's no clear evidence in any particular direction. I think it's the American Psychological Association who say there's no clear consensus among scientists. So there's no strong evidence that it's linked to any sort of gay gene. There's just no evidence for that at all. I guess the difficulty as well is you have people who've grown up in a similar sort of nurture environment and yet don't have the same outcome. So, for instance, my brother and I grew up in the same family. He's married to a woman. I'm same-sex attracted. You don't get a sense of same things happening across families with similar experiences. There's just no strong evidence in one direction. a reason for same-sex attraction.
And then even if you do find the reason, and you go on your search for this is the reason why I'm gay, same-sex attracted, what do you do? I mean, so, if for instance you did a profile of me and then you worked out that, I wasn't very sporty because I can't quite see where a ball is in any sort of sporty game. And you think, oh, well, perhaps the reason Ed's gay, same-sex attracted is that but he was never good at sports, and that sort of created a distance between him and the guys he was growing up with. And he started to fancy some of the guys who were sportsmen, which is something he wasn't. And this is what we need to repair in him to make him same-sex attracted. I mean, not to make him opposite-sex attracted. The problem is, what are you going to do? Are you going to do the eye surgery that stops me having a squint and brings perfect eye to hand coordination into my life? Well, you can't do that. It doesn't exist. So you might have found the cause. You might have come up with your theory, but once you've got the theory, there's actually nothing you can do to change the wiring of my body, which has actually potentially got nothing to do with sexuality and more towards hand-to-eye coordination. So sometimes you have this long search for this is the reason, and then actually there's nothing you can do about the particular reason, even if you wanted to.
And the idea that there's one particular reason we just need to dismiss. We need to acknowledge there may be different factors, where we grew up, situations we faced in childhood. All of those things may play a part, but there is no way you can pinpoint that is the one thing. No way of allocating sort of different proportions to different events. It's just too complex for that. And so we need to avoid simplistic solutions to this, as though there is one issue that you can pinpoint. It is just more nuanced, just more difficult to untangle than that.
I definitely agree with that, and I think it's really important and helpful, especially when sort of thinking about other people, not to try and pigeonhole people into specific categories and to do a sort of cause and effect type thing with them. But I think it is helpful sometimes to explore our own story, and I've certainly found it helpful just to think through some of the influences in my life, my sort of childhood and schooling, and some of the leaders that I was very influenced by when I was younger. And it's been helpful for me to sort of bring God into that and to think about what some of those influences did to me, but again, I always steer clear of saying, this is what made me gay, because I think it probably is a mixture of nature and nurture and all sorts of different things playing into that. But I think it can sometimes be helpful to at least ask the question and to bring God into some of the broken relationships, some of the difficult things, and to just allow his kind of grace to meet you in those things, even though that's not necessarily going to make a difference to my sexuality now. For me, it's just helpful to understand my story a bit more.
One reason sometimes people give, which maybe we haven't touched on yet, which maybe helpfully allows us to illustrate and to put into practice some of the cautions of me saying, is the impact that trauma and traumatic events can have on us. So it can be the case for some people that traumatic events shape their sexuality. I'm actually aware of someone who went through a traumatic sexual event as a young woman, and they would actually say that on the back of that, they chose to be a lesbian and to enter only into same-sex relationships. And so sometimes, even with someone's own awareness, trauma can directly impact. Sometimes it could be a more subtle thing. But also it's important here to recognise these cautions we're saying of it's not, no one of these answers are one size fits all. It's not the case that every same-sex attracted person has experienced trauma which has led to their experience of sexuality. It's not the case that, as sometimes people like us get told, there must be a hidden experience of trauma we're not aware of, that something must have happened to us even if we didn't know, and that has shaped our sexuality. And so I think what hopefully is coming out in this discussion about the various different things we've touched on that may influence is all of them may in some cases influence. It's never easy, if even possible, to actually isolate which may have influenced any individual. It may be none of them actually relevant to a particular individual. And so we need to be really careful not to take them as a one size fits all, or to assume that for any one person, any one reason is true.
And I think, particularly because it can be really traumatic, for instance, to be told, as I've been told, you must have been sexually abused by a man or an older boy as a child to be same-sex attracted. It's actually traumatic to tell somebody that. Or it can be really traumatic for family relationships for you to be told that it's all your mum or your dad's fault. And I can think of friends whose relationship with their parents was fine, but has been mucked up by some Christian who thinks they know why people are gay, going around their family and doing an archaeological dig in which they have, actually just destroyed what were really good relationships before this Christian came along with their not particularly helpful or nuanced theory.
Yeah, I agree with that. I had various possibilities that have been lobbed at me from being at a boys' school or having chosen it. I just think that's unhelpful. The sort of trying to play amateur psychiatrist isn't really a helpful way to encourage somebody who's same-sex attracted.
That's such a good point. And it comes to this question, and everyone suddenly is a qualified psychiatrist, apparently. Yeah, and which any of us can fall into that trap, and that's just a really helpful caution, actually. We're going to take a pause there, but after the break, we're going to come back and think specifically how we as Christians can bring a Christian perspective to this question.
Thanks to everyone who's come on our training days so far. We're coming to Colchester on the 14th of May, so do join us to explore sexuality in our culture, the biblical picture, and how we can support same-sex attracted Christians in church. Go to livingout.org for more information.
We're answering the question, why am I gay? And we've considered some of the popular answers. We've sought to evaluate them a bit and kind of recognise that all of them might sometimes be at play for individual, but actually none of them are one-size-fits-all answers, and we can't ever assume that all or any of them are at play in a particular person's experience. What about then, for us as Christians, how does our Christian faith help us? How does a Christian perspective help us to consider the question why some people are gay?
Well, I used to do, I went for a stage of doing quite a bit of amateur psychology on myself. And then actually I found that the most helpful thing I could do was to open up my Bible and find out the answers that the Bible has. And the range of answers and the nuanced range of answers that the Bible has as to, why I'm gay, same-sex attracted. And I found help in two particular answers. One, that I've been created in the image of God, but that image has been ruined in some way by human sin, and therefore I have good desires, but those desires have been corrupted by sin. And I found that actually really, really helpful to make sense of what's happened with my sexuality. It's a good thing, a good gift from a good God, but I've just corrupted it in various ways, as we all have. Whatever our sexuality. So I found that, doctrine of original sin, one of the most basic Christian doctrines around, incredibly helpful, as well as believing that God's sovereign over all things and that God is not surprised that I've ended up experiencing same-sex attraction, that God is not in heaven sort of tearing his hair out thinking everything's gone wrong. I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to use this to help Ed Shaw become more and more like Jesus, to help Ed Shaw help others to become more and more like Jesus too. No, in fact, God is taking and using all things for the good of those who love him. Let's really believe in Romans 8:28 and actually recognise that one of the things God's most used in my life to help me grow in my love of Christ, to help me understand how much God in Christ loves me and to help other people love Christ more, is my experience of same-sex attraction. And I've got to the point, I think, in my life when actually if God said to me, okay, I'm going to take it away tomorrow, I would actually be quite worried, because I'd want to say to God, oh, actually, it's been such a good thing in my life to stop me from being self-righteous, for instance. It's been such a good thing in my life to that's helped me help other people. I'd actually question whether it is actually a good thing in some ways to take it away, because he's done so much good through it in my own life, and I think in the lives of other people too.
That's helpful to hear your experience, Ed. But I guess people might wonder, is it just you? So, Anne, maybe you've got any views on this? Has it been a good thing for you that God has used your experience same-sex attraction in your life?
Yeah, I mean, it's taken a while to really appreciate that. I think there were quite a number of years when I was younger where I wouldn't have said it was a good thing, but actually the longer I've been a Christian and the more I reflect, the more I realise he has used it for so much good. I think it's helped me to sort of take the Bible seriously and take my discipleship seriously, because it's not one of those issues you can just kind of sideline or park. So I've had to wrestle with, do I really believe what the Word of God says, do I really believe that God loves me and that I want to follow him? So it's helped me to develop an intimacy with God that I'm not sure I would have had otherwise. I think as well, like Ed says, I think it's helped me to be sort of humble and to recognise how sinful I am, I suppose, because, whenever I'm starting to think that I'm quite good, I'm reminded that, I have a broken sexuality like everybody else, but, mine is quite obvious and, quite sort of difficult to hide. So it means I lean on God's grace more. I think it kind of prepared me for lifelong singleness as well. A lot of my friends have spent a lot of their 20s basically wanting to get married and, wondering if each guy they met was the one and that kind of thing. Whereas, I kind of recognised that I was going to be single long term, so I could really invest in that. And I think that's been really helpful. I think it's helpful for mission as well. People are quite intrigued by my life. Often if I say that I'm gay and choosing not to act on that because I'm a Christian, it just intrigues people, and so it's often a good way to talk about Jesus and why I live the way that I do. And again, it helps to relate with other people that struggle with big things. I think. I think if I hadn't had this particular struggle, I could have quite easily coasted along a little bit and not been able to empathise with the pain and suffering of others quite so well. I've written an article on this on the website. I think it's called "What's Good About Struggling with Same-Sex Attraction." So if anybody wants to know why it's not all bad news, then they can have a look at that.
It's interesting, isn't it? We don't all know why we're gay, but we're all united in saying that God has done good things through it. So probably one of the most important moments of my life was being in church, hearing a sermon on 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where Paul talks about his thorn in the flesh, which was deeply painful for him, and he asked, Lord, take it away from me. And I think listening to that sermon as a 19, 20-year-old at that time, I was praying, Lord, take my sexuality away from me. But the thing about the thorn in the flesh that God doesn't take away is it keeps Paul humble, relying on him, learning about God's strength in his weakness. And I'd just say that's my testimony as well. Lots of other areas of life have been relatively smooth. I would be probably irritatingly arrogant, actually, but for my sexuality, and if at least probably now I'm slightly less irritatingly arrogant, but just would say, at times it's felt like a thorn in the flesh, but God hasn't taken it away. That's often the phrase I would use. I don't quite know why I'm gay, but I know God hasn't removed my same-sex attraction because he wants to do good things through it.
We've highlighted here God's sovereignty as one of the things within Christian belief that helps us. That, for me, raises the question of, well, does that mean that God made me gay? How would you process that? What would your answer be to the question, did God make you gay?
I mean, personally, I wouldn't use that phrase. It's interesting, actually, just seeing how things have changed. So 15 years ago, people would say to me, maybe you're gay because you went to a boys' school. Actually, the thing people now say to me is, well, maybe you're gay because God made you that way. Personally, that's not a phrase that I use, and the reason is because of what Ed said. At least part of my same-sex attraction is down to sort of broken desires that at least have the temptation to go in a sinful direction. So it's not a phrase I'm particularly comfortable using. So I wouldn't say God made me that way. What I would say, as I've just said, is God hasn't taken it away. And what you see all the way through the Bible is just the beauty of God taking things that are part of a broken world and doing good through them. And that would be my testimony. I wouldn't say God made me that way, but I would say God has worked through that, hopefully to do good.
It's one of the great things about being a Christian, isn't it? Is God's ability to take weakness and suffering and evil and bring good out of them. And the place we see that most of all is the cross of Jesus, where that is what God does. He takes things that are wrong and are painful and are hard, and he does good. He does the most good he's ever done in saving the world through the death of his son Jesus. And so as Christians, we should always be willing to reckon with God being able to take things which are painful and hard and which are challenging and which incorporate, pain and suffering, and use them for good, because that's what God is able to do and willing to do. And we see that most of all on the cross of Jesus.
Ed mentioned the image of God earlier, and I think there's another way in that is part of how Christian faith helps us in this question. People have observed that the more people believe that same-sex attraction is rooted in nature, in genetics, something in the way that we're born, the more people tend to be just kind towards and not prejudiced against gay people and stuff. And people say, actually, we should kind of play up that research in a sense to do that. But actually, as Christians, we have a much better answer to that, actually. It doesn't need to be that. Actually, we need to be born a certain way to people to be kind to us and not to be prejudiced against us, actually, because every single living human being bears the image of God. We have inherent worth and dignity. We, of all people, are those who say every person is worthy of good treatment. Every person is worthy of being treated equally. The reason we're a society that believes that really is because of historic Christian belief. And so the image of God also, for me, is just helpful when it comes to Christian faith and this question, because it says we don't need to know the biological roots necessarily, whether they may or may not be there in any significant way. We know we will have inherent worth and value anyway because we're made in God's image. And one last question then, guys. What would you say to a Christian teenager who thinks they're gay or same-sex attracted, who hasn't told anyone yet maybe about that, and who is just in their own mind wrestling with the question of why they are gay or same-sex attracted?
I think we've mentioned on other podcasts that for somebody who's struggling on their own, thinking about their sexuality and everything, it's quite important to find somebody that is safe to talk to, that you can be open with and that you trust. Because I think it's very difficult to wrestle with questions of sexuality and identity on your own. So that's one thing I would say. Try and find somebody that it's safe to talk to and explore these things with, that isn't going to label you or push you down a certain route, and isn't going to do some of the things that we've just been talking about, like try and root around for a cause, or try and sort of blame parents, or try and, zone in on something that needs to be changed or healed, because I think we've talked about how dangerous that can be and how unhelpful. So yeah, find a safe space, somebody to talk to that isn't going to push you into the sort of blame or cure avenues that we've talked about.
I guess one of the reasons, somebody might be asking, why am I gay, is a, fundamental and perhaps understandable dissatisfaction with that state of affairs. But I suppose I want to sort of remind anybody in that situation of the stories we've shared of being same-sex attracted, being gay, being a hard and difficult thing, but it also being the thing that God has most used in our lives to help us become like him and to help others become like him too. And if you're someone whose great passion is to become more and more like Jesus and to help other people become more and more like him too, and you're asking this question, why am I gay? God's answer might be, this is the very thing I'm going to use to do what you're most passionate about. And I think I referred to being asked the question at a conference, how can I avoid my child becoming like you? And that a friend answered the question for me. And the friend who answered the question for me basically said, in front of hundreds of people in a way that moved me to tears, where he basically said the people he most respected as Christians, the people he most saw Christ-likeness in, and the people he most saw helping other people becoming Christ-like were all gay, same-sex attracted people. And he said, if I, as a dad, this was his friend of mine speaking, want my children to grow up to be like Jesus and to help other people become like Jesus too, why would I be so petrified about them being gay if that seems to be a way that God often seems to achieve that in other people? And it was an incredibly moving, sort of life-changing answer to hear. And any of us who are struggling with our sexuality, or to be honest, any form of suffering, perhaps what we need to hear is actually, this might be the crucible. And I use the word crucible because it'll be painful, but this might be the crucible, the way in which God forms us and refines us in the way that will help us make the biggest impact for him.
There's a lovely bit in Greg Cole's book, Single Gay Christian. I think it's the appendix where he writes a letter to his sort of 13-year-old self, basically saying it will be okay. I think that's right. I mean, the Lord will work slowly, so sometimes it will need patience, and the kind of lessons that we've shared, we probably didn't learn in an instant, but over 10, 15, 20, 25 years, the Lord does teach us those lessons. He does keep us going, and I think I would probably write the same sort of letter to my 16-year-old self. It will be okay. So I would say to the teenager, be patient, Trust the Lord. Don't panic trying to ask the why questions, but trust that the Lord knows and that he's good and that he will look after you.
Really helpful wisdom. Thanks so much, guys. You might also, listeners, be interested in Ed's article, Why Are Some People Same-Sex Attracted? You can find that at livingout.org, which explores some of this that we've been discussing through today as well. That is, though, sadly, all we've got time for today. My thanks to Ed and Andy, and thanks to you for listening. And that actually is the end of our current series. But don't worry, we will be back in not too long with a brand new season, so stay tuned. And in the meantime, why not like and subscribe and leave a review so that other people can find these conversations and hopefully find them helpful too. We look forward to being with you next time in the next season of the Living Out podcast.